Hi, I'm Harry Jarin. Glad to be part of TANTV's Civics and Political Voices Network.
Hello, I'm Adedaya. You're welcome to TANTV's Civics and Political Voices Network. As you know, we've continued this series where we serve as a platform for civic voices and leaders in the area, in the local DMV area, where they get to really talk to you about the issues that matters to them and of course their constituents and local residents. So I'm very pleased to have with me Harry Jarin, who is running for Congress from District 5. And I'm sure you have a lot to share with us today.
I'm sure I do.
So I just really want us to sort of just get into it. You're a businessman, you're a volunteer firefighter.
Yes.
You went to Wharton, and you're running in this sort of very competitive race.
It's a very crowded race.
It's a very crowded race. It's a very competitive race. So I'm very curious, first of all, given your background, you don't really have that institutional like the other opponents do. So what makes you feel like you can win this race?
It's a great question. So first off, I'll say that while my career, my background, you're right, I don't have a background in politics. I'm not a current sitting career politician like a lot of the other candidates. However, my partner worked at the DNC for many years, and my family has been deeply involved in politics. So I've been, I would say, politics adjacent. I've been a spectator to politics, but a front row spectator. I've seen through his work at the DNC how the party operates on the inside. I've seen how the sausage is made. Yeah. And frankly, I'm not impressed. It was very apparent to me being on the inside of the Biden administration, going to events at the White House or the Treasury Department or the DNC, talking to people who were very, very high ranking in the administration, including the one that I'm married to, seeing how the DNC operates from the inside. I would then go back to my community in Maryland. I go back to my firehouse in Maryland. I listen to the conversations that I hear around my own community on the ground. And it was very apparent to me why the Democratic Party is failing to communicate with the voters that we need to win across the country. And ultimately, that's where my motivation to get involved in politics comes from, because I don't think that the Democratic Party, as it's currently structured, is putting up enough of a fight against the Trump administration. They don't really have a plan for how to push back against a fascist administration.
So here's the thing, and I'm just, I had a whole script here, but I'm dropping that because I want to talk to you on, like, just real, right? First of all, about the Democratic Party. Why is it that you guys don't seem to want to get along? Why is it that we have we're just talking about how many candidates currently running?
22 candidates still in the race, yes.
And when you say they're not, Democrats are not this, they're not that, but you're still a part of that party.
Absolutely.
So what exactly is missing? And why can't we why can't Democrats have one mind to fight Donald Trump?
I do think that there are competing ideas about how to push back against Donald Trump. But right now, the leadership of the party is still very much dominated by a much older generation that includes our current District 5 Congressman, Steny Hoyer, who entered Congress in 1981.
And he was there for 44 years.
He was there
44 years.
He's been there the whole time.
He just now left the seat, and he actually picked or endorsed Adrian Boafo.
That's correct.
So tell me.
And this is getting to, this is where I'm going with this, is he's very much part of a generation that back in the 1980s, 1990s, the Republican Party was still, to a large extent, a normal political party. We still had fairly normal policy debates. It didn't feel like every single election was an existential crisis. The Republican Party of today is much, much different than the Republican Party of 40 years ago. My problem with our current Democratic Party leadership is that they're still operating as if it was the same old Republican Party, as if we could trust Republican politicians to operate in good faith, and we can't anymore. The Republican Party has been completely co-opted by a white supremacist fascist movement, which is MAGA. And Democratic politicians, especially those in leadership, are still operating as if the Republican Party is the Republican Party of 1981, when Steny Hoyer entered Congress, when Chuck Schumer entered Congress. And they haven't made the adjustments that they need to. This has been going on. This is not anything new. Yeah. This has now been going on for an entire decade. Donald Trump really entered the political scene in 2015. So it's not like we haven't had a chance to experience this shift. It's just a question of our Democratic leadership not being able to adjust to this new political reality. And simply replacing Steny Hoyer, who turns 87 next week, simply replacing him with someone much younger who operates in exactly the same way, that doesn't really solve the problem. And so yes, you're right, there is this internal fight in the Democratic Party. Yeah. It's not necessarily just about policy, about more progressive policies versus more centrist policies. I think the issue is deeper than that. It's really about the kind of politicians we're putting forward. Look at, as you mentioned, the Steny Hoyer endorsed candidate, Delegate Adrienne Boafo, who is being backed with, I believe as of yesterday, over $6 million in super PAC funding from AIPAC, from a very powerful cryptocurrency PAC, and several other groups. That's the kind of Democratic Party that voters have really lost trust in. And that's what needs to change.
So let's talk more about that, right?
Yeah.
About the monies and who is getting funded and what does that really mean for this race and for what should, when you're backed by institutions, like not you, but someone like Adrienne Boafo being backed by AIPAC and different institutions, but then has also gotten endorsement from the likes of Also Brooks, whom a lot of people look up to and respect, and you don't believe is backed by institutional funding like that, or even if I'm not sure if Westmore has endorsed him, I don't know. But I know for a fact that Also Brooks has endorsed Adrienne Boafo, and of course Steny Hoyer endorsed him as well. But what does that really say about getting institutional funding and where the voters should live?
It's a good question. So first, when we talk about endorsements like that, my impression, this is my speculation, is that because it was such a crowded field and Adrienne was not doing so well early on in his campaign, I think Steny Hoyer made a few phone calls to figures like Senator Also Brooks and Congresswoman Elfreth and others in the Democratic Party to try to circle the wagons around him, to try to consolidate that wing of the party supporting Adrienne Boafo. That said, you make a really good point about influence from some of these outside groups. Yeah. And I would point to the statement of the other Maryland Senator, Chris Van Hollen, just the other day, who pointed out this enormous amount of money that's been spent. And it really, it's important to note that this amount of money really dwarfs the amount of money that we as the candidates have actually raised ourselves. Yeah. Adrienne Boafo, I believe in Q1 raised something like $460,000. Compare that to now over $6 million that's been raised, right? So more than 10 times the amount that he's actually raised for his own campaign is being spent by these outside groups. And as Senator Van Hollen pointed out earlier this week, these groups are not doing this out of charity. They are going to expect something in return.
So now let's make the viewers, the voters understand what happens if it seems like someone has been endorsed or you spent over $6 million in promoting and advertising a candidate like Adrienne Boafo, right? What does that tell voters about that particular seat in Congress? What power does that seat have? So that people understand what's at stake, right?
Sure.
Like when you're in that position, what are some things that, you know, people expect from you?
Absolutely. And I've spoken to several former members of Congress who went through this process. It's actually not a very fun job, especially, you know, it's much easier if you're from Maryland and you can just commute back and forth to Washington, D.C. You know, Steny Hoyer only lives an hour outside the district. You know, I only live 45 minutes. I believe Adrian Boafo lives in Bowie. It's a very quick commute. But I talked to several former members of Congress who are commuting from the West Coast. It's actually a very miserable job going back and forth, having to go back and deal with constituent services in your own district and fundraising in your own district, flying back and forth for votes. And a big part of being a member of Congress is that in order to keep your seat, you're running for re-election every 2 years. Fundraising is such a huge part of it. You're constantly on the road fundraising and dealing with different PACs and lobbying groups. Ultimately, these groups they have influence in our elections because members of Congress are so beholden to them. They're so reliant on this fundraising apparatus that as soon as they stop fundraising, it's pretty much all over, and it's very, very difficult. Once you get off sides with some of these groups, it's very, very difficult to come back from that. I can tell you, even just as an upstart candidate who challenged Steny Hoyer in the primary starting last year, it was very difficult to even find vendors who would work with me, someone to deal with my federal compliance paperwork, because a lot of these firms that are based in Washington, D.C., they said, oh, well, if we took you on as a client,
we can take somebody else.
Well, Steny Hoyer would make one phone call, and that would be the end of our DCCC business. No, we wouldn't be able to work with anyone else. And so you have these very powerful political structures that incentivize this current system of PACs and lobbying groups and outside influence on these members of Congress. So I think ultimately this is less up to the voters than we might like to think.
Which is sad, which is extremely sad.
And I'll add that if there's anything I've learned in however many months I've been on the campaign trail is that voters are not very good at
that was actually going to be my next question about the fact that we're almost at the last stretch of this.
Yes.
And you've been on the campaign trail. So I want to know, what are you feeling from, are you talking to voters? Are you, what are you feeling?
I've talked to a lot of voters.
What is the energy? What is the temperature like with voters? What are the key issues or top 3 issues that they care about?
Sure. So before I go into the, I have a few issues that I've certainly heard about, but I would just add that to touch on your last point about outside groups influencing this campaign. I found that voters are not very good at math, to be honest. That the difference between a million and a billion and a trillion is a little bit hard for people to get their
head around.
Yeah, it's hard to get your mind around it. And so the problem is when outside groups spend $6 million or whatever the final number will end up at in this campaign. The impression that voters get from that is that the Democratic Party is just as corrupt as the Republican Party, which of course is not really true. The corruption of the Republican Party and the Trump administration is on a completely different level from
the Democratic Party?
Yes, right. Okay. And part of this is how our media is structured. I heard on Fox News, they didn't want to talk about anything else except Hunter Biden's stupid paintings. For years, they went on about something like that. And I think Hunter Biden said on social media the other day.
I saw that.
Yeah. He made something like $225,000 off of his paintings. It's a minuscule amount compared to Donald Trump, who's increased his net worth by several $1 billion since coming back into office. So you're talking several orders of magnitude difference. But the impression that voters get, I think it's very hard for voters to parse that out. And so going around the district, talking to a lot of voters, we all get the mail from United Democracy Project, which is AIPAC, from Protect Progress, which is the cryptocurrency PAC. They've sent every Democratic voter in the district many, many pieces of mail supporting Adrian Boafo. His TV ads are on many popular channels. We've all seen them. And so the biggest feedback I've gotten from a lot of voters is that, this whole thing is kind of bought and paid for. And unfortunately, I don't see as much excitement around this race that I've seen around some of the other competitive primary elections in other districts around the country.
But you do have some promising other opponents that you're running against, like Walla Gay.
I'm very excited about it, of course, because I'm very deep in it. But the impression I've gotten from a lot of voters is they say, look, I'm happy to support you, but I feel like the fix is in. There's a feeling among voters, a lot of voters feel resigned to this system of big super PACs.
Almost like whatever they do isn't gonna.
Yes, and I think it's a very toxic feeling of helplessness. And remember, I'm basically only talking to Democratic voters.
Yeah.
So I think it's a big warning sign for our democracy. Unless we make really significant structural reforms, I don't know how we can sustain this.
How do you also measure up your race to the likes of Harry Jarin? Is it? How do you also?
Yeah, there are a couple different Harrys.
He's the hero now, right, from the January 6th incident. So how do you compare?
Absolutely. Look, I'm in this race. There are 21 other candidates. I can't go around. I don't have enough time to go around telling everyone why each one of them shouldn't be elected. I really have to say why I should be elected, and I can really only focus on myself. I will say I have a great rapport with Harry Jarin. We've had a great time on the campaign trail. He's, we at these candidate forums, we talk about each other not as competitors. We say, we're colleagues in this. At the end of the day, we're all on the same side. So I can only run my race and go out and tell people why I think I'm the best candidate. So
let's do that.
Okay.
Why don't you tell us, why are you the best candidate out of the crowded race we're seeing right now?
Sure. So a few things. First, I'm not a career politician. I think we have enough career politicians in Congress right now. That's part of how we ended up in this mess. As we've been talking about many of these outside groups, I don't take any money from any corporate PACs or groups like AIPAC. My campaign is entirely financed with my own money and individual contributions, and that's it.
Okay, so still on the money, do you, from your campaign, right, and you took out a loan for yourself, but you also did you get any public financing with that?
No. Okay. It's entirely individual contributions.
How are you building a base as well, right? Like where does the grassroots come in? Absolutely.
So I think this also touches on your previous question. Yeah. I think I'm the only candidate in the race that's really demonstrated a fluency in the world of social media. There are many candidates who operate, as we discussed earlier, there are many candidates who operate in a more traditional way through establishment media sources. But I think that's been a really fundamental failing of the Democratic Party, is that we haven't made this adjustment to the digital age. And I actually wrote a whole op-ed about this back in the fall before Steny Hoyer announced his retirement. I wrote a whole op-ed in the Baltimore Sun on this exact issue.
Well, you should bring it here, because
I'll make sure you get the link. Yes.
You should send it to TANTV, because I've heard a lot of things about Baltimore Sun that we're not going to go into, so you should bring it here.
I'll absolutely share that op-ed with your viewers. I think it's a really important point. This is actually something that the Republicans have been much better at, is making that adjustment to the new information environment. And for better or for worse, we as Democrats, we want to be seen as the party of serious people and serious policy, but we also have to admit that continuing to rely on the way we operate in the media environment, the same way we did 30 or 40 years ago, is simply not working. And we've seen how that played out, in the last 10 years. And so I think I'm really one of the only candidates in the race that's demonstrated an ability to function in this new information space. We really have built a solid following in the district, specifically on social media. That's where I've gotten a lot of our volunteers. A lot of our volunteers for phone banking and door knocking have come through social media. People simply sending us a direct message on Instagram or TikTok saying, "Hey, I want to help out your campaign." And so it's certainly not the traditional way that campaigns operate, but I think this is important for the new generation of Democratic politicians to make that switch.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk about some issues.
Yes, absolutely.
And your stance. So housing, affordable housing has been a big hot topic on grounds, rightfully
Certainly.
so, because you have residents that are hurting. There is a crisis, a housing crisis. So what is your take on that?
Absolutely, and this has been a really central part of my campaign from day one, talking about housing and transit, because I think we talk about these, in the United States, we often talk about housing and transit as two separate issues. And I think in a lot of other developed Western countries, they do a much better job of integrating those two issues. I think part of this, and this is a little bit inside baseball, but anyone watching who is a lawyer or has been to law school or has any familiarity with the different legal systems, I think this is just a weakness of our legal system, which is based on English common law. We've seen in the last 40 years, especially, basically every English-speaking country, it's not just the United States, basically every English-speaking country has fallen behind in how quickly we build housing. The United States, Canada, England, Ireland, Australia, Canada, all these countries are not building houses at a quick enough pace, and all these countries have seen housing prices go up really, really quickly. Part of that is because in our common law legal system, it's much harder for a civil authority to come up with a long-term planning process and stick to it. It's much easier to derail a long-term plan for a certain part of a city or county through lawsuits. And I think that's simply a weakness of our planning processes. I would also add that in the United States, we have very strict environmental laws, such as the National Environmental Protection Act, which of course were put in place in many cases by Democrats in the 1960s and 70s to slow down a lot of the really destructive highway projects that were done at that time. For example, the Highway to Nowhere in Baltimore, or even earlier than that, the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York City, a lot of really notorious development projects like that. And absolutely, a law like that was necessary to allow for the public to have some sort of input in public projects like that. However, those same processes that we put in place, ostensibly to protect the environment, those same processes are now being used to slow down or stop public transit projects that would obviously benefit the environment. And so the solution to all this is, number one, reforms to the National Environmental Protection Act to exempt or speed up transit projects, and number two, a national transit-oriented development policy to allow for dense, walkable communities to be built around those transit stations. And that's actually something, we actually have a lot of really good transit infrastructure in Maryland. We're starting to use it a little bit more effectively, and so in my district, in District 5, there are actually already development plans to build dense, high-density housing and walkable communities around the Odenton and Bowie State MARC rail stations. That's a good first step, but that also has to be accompanied by faster and more frequent MARC rail service. It also has to be accompanied by zoning changes on the federal level. I would like to see a federal adoption of essentially, there was a bill in California that was passed recently to allow by right certain density zoning within a quarter or a half mile of transit stations. I would like to see a federal adoption of that policy. And the last thing I'd mention on this housing issue is a project like Southern Maryland Rapid Transit, which is supposed to convert an old freight rail line in southern Prince George's and Charles County into passenger rail. And I think this part of the district has seen a lot of underinvestment over the past 20, 30 years. Through my consulting work, I work with a lot of the fire departments in Charles County. These are very fast-growing areas, but the planning has not really kept up with the rate of growth. It seems like every other week they take a farm and turn it into a new subdivision of single-family housing, and the number one issue I hear about when I go and talk to voters, especially in that part of the district, is traffic. The traffic is unbelievably bad, and especially now that a lot of federal workers are going back to the office. They're being forced back in the office by the Trump administration 5 days a week. People have to commute very long distances.
You're leading us to another topic, which is the layoff of a lot of federal workers and the district is a high area.
I believe we have the
NIH
highest percentage of federal workers
Yeah.
than any congressional district other than Washington, D.C. itself.
Yeah, so what do you have to say to federal workers, and if you were to get into office, what would you do differently as a solution?
Absolutely. So number one, reverse a lot of the cuts to
The DOGE cuts
yes,
that happened?
absolutely. But the more fundamental issue is what allowed us to get to that point. A lot of federal workers, and I think that even if you ask a lot of the DOGE personnel, they thought they were going to get in there and they're going to find all sorts of waste, fraud, and abuse. That's their catchphrase. Mm-hmm. They thought they were going to find all sorts of waste, and they would make a lot of very easy cuts to federal services and create all these savings. And actually what they found when they really got into some of these agencies is they found that federal workers are actually doing a very efficient job. And
so if they found that, why did they still move on with the cuts?
They had a political directive from up above. And I would also say they were poisoned by decades of Republican rhetoric about federal workers. This has been going on for decades now, really since the early 1980s, since the Reagan administration, painting federal agencies and federal workers as leeches on the system, when in fact they're doing really essential work that we don't always hear about. Recently there was, I believe last week, they discovered a screw worm in cattle in Texas that had previously been eradicated from US cattle herds in the 1960s. For many years, the United States had a program to drop genetically modified flies into Central America that would prevent the spread of this particular worm further north. That was one of the programs that was affected by the DOGE cuts, and here we are, not even a year later, and
we expect to see more things.
Exactly, and so I think it's a really good example of the kind of work that some of these agencies or that USAID was doing. A lot of these programs were portrayed as wasteful foreign aid programs when in fact they really directly benefited the United States and the United States economy. I don't think that we as Democrats, as people who in many cases initiated or promoted these programs, we didn't do a good job of communicating why they were important. And so we left the field, we weren't even playing on the field, and we left the field open to Republicans to demonize federal workers and a lot of these federal programs. And that's part of what I was mentioning earlier about the new information environment. And so I think that's the biggest difference in how I would operate versus our current crop of congressmen or members of Congress, is changing the way that I communicate, and I would be much more public in promoting the work of our federal workers, who in many cases are doing very difficult, detailed work, but they're doing it behind the scenes. And a lot of people simply don't appreciate what they're doing, especially in the attention economy.
Yeah, so on healthcare, one of your opponents, who is, she's, again, we also had her on here, and she's I guess been in the system for a minute in terms of like having been a council member and all that.
Yes.
And so on healthcare, I think her position is Medicare for all and all. So what is your stance on healthcare? Like what?
Absolutely, and healthcare is.
It's a serious.
I think this is the number one issue, especially for young people in the United States. And I'll say, as a firefighter myself, I see people all the time who fall through the cracks, who don't have access to health insurance, they don't have access to health care on a regular basis.
And many more would lose health care.
Absolutely. The current administration is doing their best to kick people off of the ACA bill and any Obamacare plan. They're trying to get more people off of these health insurance plans, which I think is complete lunacy, because I see people all the time who have fairly manageable medical conditions, but they can't afford to stay on their medication consistently. They can't afford to go see a doctor on a regular basis. And eventually, that manageable medical condition turns into an emergency. And that's when they call 911. And that's when we show up with a fire truck and an ambulance and take them to the emergency room. And so you end up with a significant percentage of the population that relies on the emergency room as their primary care, essentially as a last resort. At the end of the day, we all end up paying for that one way or another. And so it would be much, much more efficient if we guaranteed everyone a basic level of health care. I will say I support Medicare for all in terms of a public option. Not exactly there have been several iterations of the Medicare for all bill that have been introduced going back to 2009. I would like to see the United States adopt a system similar to Australia, which is that's where my partner is from. That I spent a lot of time in Australia. It's a system that I'm very familiar with. They also call it Medicare in Australia. They implemented it around the same time that we implemented Medicare in the United States.
So what's uniquely different?
Essentially, their Medicare is what we would call a public option, but it's by default, there's no opt-in. You simply go to the point of service, and the doctor or whoever's providing the service bills Medicare. If you want private health insurance on top of that, if you want to go to a private clinic, you can still do that. And I think it's a very efficient system. It's a system that you see in many other developed Western countries, from Switzerland to Israel to many countries have a very similar system to this. And I think that's the system that would be the easiest to implement in the United States. I actually don't support a mandatory single payer system like they have, like the NHS in the UK. I think it's much more efficient to allow for both public and private system, and that's probably the easiest to implement in the United States. And that's not based on any sort of ideology. I'm just trying to be realistic. Remember that my actual, I'm a volunteer firefighter, but my actual job is working as a consultant with fire and EMS departments all over the country. And a big problem that pretty much every fire department I work with that they have is dealing with the increase in EMS calls. That medical calls have doubled or tripled in many communities just over the past few years, because you have a lot more people relying on the 911 system and the emergency room. So simply saying that, okay, well, we're going to implement Medicare for all, and we're going to go to a single payer system, that doesn't magically produce more ambulances. It doesn't magically generate more doctors and medical providers. This is the problem this is where my Wharton education comes in. This is the problem of economics, is that there are a limited number of resources, and we have to figure out some way to allocate them.
On immigration and ICE, and then I'm just going to lump in data centers too, even though they're widely separate. What is, that's also been a key conversation, and that folks there's a clear line as to, where candidates stand, right? So where do you stand on ICE, on ICE being masked, on ICE detaining children, the whole talk of concentration camps and all that?
Absolutely. And I will say
because
that
it's not to cut you short,
no,
but
please.
of course, like locals, they care about these things, and when you have a sort of tight race, you need to sort of differentiate yourself, really.
Absolutely. And I will say, I think that this is one area where just about all of the candidates who are in the race, we all agree on an issue like abolishing ICE. We all agree that the administration's handling of the immigration issue is completely out of control. We all want to see accountability for ICE agents who have hurt or in some cases killed people. There has to be a reckoning. I would add that, as you say, I'm trying to differentiate myself from the field here. I just want to mention that I'm part of the American immigrant story too. My grandparents came to this country in the 1950s. They were Holocaust survivors. They were Jewish refugees from Europe. And I recognize that this country from day one has been a safe haven for people from all over the world. And we go through these cycles in American history, from the Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s to the anti-immigration laws of the 1920s, and now we're in kind of another phase of this, where anti-immigrant sentiment is really boiling up. But I think this is a really critical time in American history this is really the project of MAGA, is that they want to redefine who Americans are and who American institutions should benefit.
And when you say project, are you referring to Project 2025 or just the undertone of America as a whole?
Yes, Project 2025 that's a written out policy plan. But there's also the larger project of Make America Great Again, which is really a white supremacist fascist movement. That there's now talk of mass deportations, that the number keeps going up. Initially it was 10 million, and then it was 20 million, and now you actually have senior members of the administration talking about deporting 100 million people. I mean, this is really explicitly Nazi language that we're getting from administration officials that want to restore some sort of racial purity to the United States. It's really frightening, and that we do not have a precedent for in American history. Yeah. That is really, there's a big break from anything that we've had in the United States previously, and certainly a big target of their derision are more recent immigrants, especially those from Africa. We certainly have a big West African community here in Maryland that I'm very concerned about, and I don't think that really any of the other candidates in the race have been able to articulate what MAGA is in those terms. And I don't see anyone in Democratic leadership in Congress referring to what MAGA is trying to accomplish in those terms, that they are an explicitly white supremacist movement using explicitly Nazi language about racial purity. And it's really terrifying to see that these are the people who are currently in control of the administration. So I think Democrats need to be much more forceful in pushing back against that. And we see this playing out in not just in Congress, but also in legal battles, such as the recent Supreme Court decision about redistricting, that essentially the Supreme Court allowed all of the former Confederate states in the South to implement racially gerrymandered maps to ensure that there would be no black representatives coming out of those states.
That's appalling.
It is absolutely appalling, and frankly, I just don't see Democrats in leadership articulating that is what their goal is. How hard is it to simply call that out and say, well, this is what the goal of the MAGA movement is. This has been part of their legal strategy of appointing judges and appointing Supreme Court justices for decades. This has been their ultimate goal, not just to overturn the Voting Rights Act, but to render even the Reconstruction amendments that we implemented at the end of the Civil War as a dead letter. That is what their project is. And I simply don't see anyone, very few people on my side of the aisle, especially those in Congress, especially those in leadership, calling that out for what it is.
Yeah, and I truly hope that however this race goes, whoever gets to be in power, that you, as a white male that is articulating this, can actually continue to educate people on issues like this, right? Regardless of whatever the outcome is, because it's important. And I say this because we're going to have somebody, I don't know how long you have, but we're going to be having another guest shortly, who is a Montgomery County local. And something very interesting happened, just talking about the sentiment of, black and white and moving in same spaces, right? I took my kids to one of the kids' activities in the area, and he was so extra. He was a white male, young millennial man, and he was so extra kind, had so much empathy because we had gotten there towards the end of the program. And he was like, no, don't worry, the kids can still do their art and everything. And I was so touched by that. And I said, by the time we're done, he gave us extra 15 minutes for my kids to play. And when we're done, I said to him, I haven't seen this in a long time. And this means so much, that you actually showed a lot of empathy, and he broke down in tears. And I was like, I got to have you on as a civic voice. Oh, great. Right? So he's coming later to the studio and he's going to, talk to us. And But what do you have to say to white male? And he said something. He said he grew up under the Obama administration, where it seemed like there was a sense of hope that we had come from this. This is a millennial,
Yes.
grew up in the Obama administration,
Yes.
and now you have a Trump, and he's a white male, and he said he's so confused as to how to take things, and he's ashamed to walk in spaces because he feels like the Trump or any person who, Republican, whatever, is a reflection of him, and so he's extra intentional about how he moves. So I'm curious, what do you have to say to someone like that?
Sure, and of course, I don't have the experience of being black in America, but my family is Jewish. We came here as refugees. My grandmother talked about staying in segregated hotels. She was going around the southern United States when there was still segregation. I can't imagine. My grandfather spent years in a German concentration camp, and then he was resettled as a refugee in St. Louis initially. And there were still segregated bathrooms and water fountains. I mean, this is not ancient history. This, we're talking just a few decades ago. And so we've come such a long way in a very short period of time. But I think the important thing to remember is that progress is not inevitable, and that a lot of this progress that we've made can very quickly be reversed. And I would say one problem that we have, especially within the Democratic Party, is I think at some point, especially the millennial generation, we, like you say, we grew up with President Obama. We grew up at a time of expanding civil rights. Gay marriage was passed just a few years ago. It was still a time of rapid social changes, I think, for the better. But we have to recognize that this progress is not inevitable. It took very hard work, and unfortunately, a lot of this progress was not achieved through politics and legislation. A lot of these achievements were actually through the court system. And I think that's a big reason why Republicans have been so focused on the court system as a means of overturning a lot of that progress. And I think it's easy to forget that on a lot of these issues, actually, Democrats were not winning the political battles. And we didn't do the hard work of getting enough people on our side to promote these sorts of social changes. And that's something that we still have to do. It's going to be a very long road, but we also have to understand what the stakes are, that there is a very significant risk here, that all the progress that we've made over the past few decades gets reversed. And I don't think a lot of people in my party really appreciate how the situation we're in.
I appreciate that thought. Let's talk about foreign policy, and then we'll wrap up shortly.
Absolutely.
Foreign policy, I know some of the other candidates have been outright on Gaza stands and what's happening in Iran. Where do you stand on that, especially given your background, as you just said, a Jewish background?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think we should separate this out, that there are certain groups and PACs in the United States. AIPAC is probably the best known one that claim to speak for all American Jews, but I think we should also separate out Jewish people in America from the Israeli government. That we're talking about two completely separate entities.
That's important.
I think it's very important to separate this out. That there are a range of stances, not just within the American Jewish community. There are, of course, a range of stances within Israel itself, and Israeli politics is very, very complicated. I've always been an advocate for a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine crisis. It's not something I'm going to be able, I'm sure we could spend the rest of the day talking about this very, very complicated issue. But at the end of the day, you have two peoples that do not want to live in a single state with one another. I do believe that Jews should not be the only nation in the world that does not have a right to self-determination. They established their own state in their ancestral homeland. They have a right to be there, just as Palestinians who have been there for centuries as well have a right to be there. Ultimately, these two peoples need to coexist next to one another. They don't have to be best friends. but there do need to be separate states for these two peoples, and there's no way around that. And I would add that Palestinians have gained the most progress towards a state of their own at the negotiating table with the United States mediating. And so I would like to see not just the United States play that role again in a peace process, but I think Palestinians have a lot of agency here as well, that ultimately for all of the rhetoric about resistance, this has simply not been a productive 2 or 3 decades, well, it's really 2 decades for the Palestinian people. It did not have to be like this. As recently as 2001, there was a functioning international airport in Gaza that connected Gaza to the rest of the Arab world. I believe even Hillary Clinton was there for the opening of the Gaza International Airport. There were development, there was economic development, there was certainly still poverty as there is in much of the rest of the Arab world. But generally speaking, there were increased economic connections and social connections between Gaza, between Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and Israel. And then the second Intifada started. They blew up a bunch of public buses, and a public bus in Jerusalem in the morning is really a school bus. They blew up a bunch of public buses and restaurants, and that really set us down this very, very dark path. And so I would add that both Israelis and Palestinians have agency in how this has all gone down over the past 2 decades. The Israeli people, I would also add, 3 times they elected governments that promised to implement a 2-state solution. In 2005, Israel pulled all of its settlers out of Gaza, and then within just a few years, Hamas took over, and here we are today. None of this had to happen like this, and I think it's a major policy failing of the United States government that we haven't been more effective mediators in this conflict.
I'm sure there's a lot more to say.
There's a lot to say.
We'll stop
we
there.
could spend 1,000 years.
I don't want to forget about data centers and your position on data centers, because that's actually another big issue with utility prices going up, fees going up for residents, and some proposing different solutions for data centers. So what do you have to say about that?
Absolutely. So right now there are several major data center projects that are proposed around the district. There's one in Newburgh in Charles County. There's one in Lusby in Calvert County. There's also, there is a very controversial project at the Landover Mall in Prince George's County, which is not actually, it's actually just on the other, it's right on the other side of the highway from my district. But of course, it would still affect residents of that.
Guardrails around data centers.
Yes. So some specific federal guardrails I would like to see around data centers. Right now, we're relying on local communities or local county governments, really small government bodies to push back on these big tech companies. I think the federal government should really be on the side of these communities. In many cases, these underserved communities should not be relying on just their local municipal bodies to push back against a giant corporation like Amazon or Oracle, for which, by the way, Adrian Boafo is a lobbyist, but we'll come back to that. So specifically, I would like to see federal rules around setbacks from residential areas, federal rules around building data centers in environmentally sensitive areas, federal oversight of, in many cases, the real hazardous materials danger with these data centers is actually from the fire suppression systems and how the cooling water for these data centers gets recycled. This is just not something that Congress or any federal agency is really on top of. So I would be pushing very hard for rules like that in Congress. I would also say that we should have seen this problem coming from a long way off. The main reason I think people are opposed to data centers is we recognize that every new data center that comes online increases our electric bills. That if you look at your electric bill, a significant part, in some cases the majority of your bill, is actually not for supply charges. It's not even for the electricity itself. Really, the fastest growing part of your electric bill is really distribution charges. It's not your local utility company. There's one grid operator that covers the entire Mid-Atlantic, basically everything from Washington, D.C. up to New York City and west to Chicago, which is called PJM interconnection, which is that's the grid operator. They are having to invest I believe they recently announced close to $1 billion in grid upgrades really to cope with the additional load from all these new data centers coming online. And at the end of the day, ratepayers are paying for it. And so that's really the fundamental problem with data centers, is that the companies who are benefiting from the construction of these data centers and profiting from these data centers, they're not paying for the full impact of these data centers on the grid. And ultimately, individual ratepayers like you and I get hosed. And that's where the federal government needs to come in. Again, this is a problem we should have seen coming from a long way off, but Congress is simply doesn't understand the technology.
We have to wrap up, so I'll just give you 30 seconds to let the people know why they should vote for you. Just two reasons why they should vote for you.
Sure. I recognize that there are a lot of candidates in this race. If you want a career politician who operates like every other career politician, you certainly have your pick. I'm not a career politician. I'm a volunteer firefighter. I'm a small business owner. And most importantly, I'm a new dad. I have 2 newborns at home, and I want to see them grow up and have the same kinds of freedoms and opportunities that I had growing up. I recognize the progress isn't inevitable, and in Congress, I'll focus on basic cost of living issues like housing, like transit, healthcare, and childcare. I hope to earn your vote.
Well, there you have it. Harry Jarin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And as always, you can always catch the full episode and more of Harry Jarin on TANTVnews.com. Thanks for tuning into TANTV. Local journalism matters. In fact, journalism as a whole matters today more than ever, which is why we're asking for your support. You can support by donating to TANTVnews.com, by sharing, and by subscribing. So subscribe today at TANTVnews.com.